But so I'm here really because I led the BMA's, the British Medical Association's response, ethical response to the COVID pandemic. So, um, front and center, my role was to try and provide guidance to health professionals to address the kind of urgent ethical issues that the pandemic gave rise to. But I'm also an advisor to Médecins Sans Frontières. So I was also trying to provide some ethics advice on the kind of more global and humanitarian dimensions of COVID too. So safe to say I have been immersed in COVID since the moment that the news broke, really. It's been a fascinating time. It's been an awful time. It's been a challenging time, a tragic time. But it's also been unprecedented in the kind of challenges that it's thrown at us. And some of those issues have to do with things like, for example, public confidence in science. To what extent should scientific information drive decision making? And also, how do you distinguish between what is a scientific question and what is an ethical question? Because science can give you information about the rates of transmission, about medicine can talk about morbidity and mortality. But how do you make decisions when you say, well, look, because of the pandemic, different groups, different social groups, their interests was opposed in some ways. In a sense, that's a very big question. The big social question about science, the authority of science. We've also seen the authority of science undermined by social media, by conspiracy theories, by anti-vax. So those are big issues, big social issues. Also questions around confidence and trust in governance. That's been a very big issue. Who is running, who is advising the government, who's providing the information to government, who's supporting the government in ethical decision making, all these kinds of questions. Who's got a kind of, which constituencies are making themselves heard in relation to the government making decision. I sit on the government's moral and ethics advisory group, which has been advising the kind of chief medical officers around the ethics of COVID, and we saw things early on. For example, faith groups were saying, well, funerals are a massive part of our spiritual life, of our communal life, they're a massive part of grieving, and yet nobody was paying attention to the fact that people were unable to attend funerals, that people were, and so you start to see this very complex a picture emerging, and so questions of governance. I think unquestionably, what front and center, one of the big issues during COVID has been questions of fairness and justice. Upon whom do the burdens fall? Why is it again that we see that some of the poorest people in the country are the most exposed? We saw early on people working in the gig economy, people whose income is entirely dependent upon their ability to go out to work day by day. Well, of course, they were massively more exposed because they simply couldn't afford. They weren't in a position. And the question and justice and fairness in terms of ethnicity in the UK, we saw early on, it became very evident that people from BAME communities were at greater risk. We saw that older people were at greater risk, so issues around justice, but geographical issues of fairness as well. You saw COVID in some ways entrenching pre-existing inequalities. So I think those three issues I would look at as the broad big picture issues, which are to do with science and the role of science, governance, issues around governance, and fundamentally, I think, matters of justice. I mean, there are a couple of issues that seem to me to be particularly urgent, and I'm going to put my kind of medical ethics cap firmly on here. And one of the things that we have seen, we saw this enormous focus on COVID and COVID-related illness. And you think, okay, we've got an explosive pandemic, uncertain about its effects, how to control it, etc., etc. In the beginnings, you think, okay, that's absolutely front and center, absolutely justified. But also what started to happen is people with non-COVID related physical problems, health-related problems, were increasingly pushed back. Treatment was deferred. People, and we're talking about people with some very, very serious illnesses here, cancer particularly. How fair is that allocation? This terrible tension we saw between people who were whose actions and behaviour was other regarding, people who were willing to strongly sacrifice their own self-interests, their own short-term, near-term self-interest, even their own long-term self-interest, in terms of making decisions to control the pandemic, to to isolate, to withdraw, and another aspect of society which didn't seem to respond in the same kind of way, a tension between one's private interests and the public good in a way. How do we have a really informed public national debate about this tension between private self-interests and the public and the common good, and a pandemic really throws that into stark relief.